Hello there, I'm Chris Schmidt, and welcome to part 1 of the instructional video series for Rocket Lasso's Slicer plugin. In order to create a slicer, you need to go to your Plugins dropdown or your Extensions dropdown. Once you've done that, then you will find Rocket Slicer, of course assuming that you've installed it. Once you've created it, you'll see this widget showing the top, the bottom, a series of representations of where the lines will be, this up directional arrow, and these handles, top and bottom. Selecting the slicer itself, you can see that we've got a bunch of different settings inside of the main tab, which is mostly where we will spend our time in this video, and make sure you check out the other parts to get additional information. To start though, the very first parameter is source geometry, and that is a mode for are we going to drag objects as a child of the slicer, or are we going to select objects and then remote link into them. We'll keep it simple for right now, stay on children, and we can now drag the landscape as a child, and the instant that we do, you'll see that the landscape gets consumed because this is a generator object and it's now returning something, in this case a series of cuts, cutting straight through the geometry. Selecting the slicer, we can see we've got all these other settings. The first one to skip to is slices, and let's increase that and get a whole bunch of extra cuts going. The next most important setting is probably the spread, and that's the overall size of this, top and bottom. So if I change the spread, you can see we go smaller or taller, and cuts will only happen where those two things are intersecting each other. In addition, you can grab these handles, drag them up and down, and control the spread that way as well. Let's open up another file in order to continue. In this file, I have got an animated figure. If I hit play, you can see it's already animated. Let's show the polygons. Now, this figure was created by using the mocap data included in newer versions of Cinema, applied to a rig. I threw that rig then into a volume builder and a volume mesher, which then got put into a remesher to make the poly count very even, and then I baked that out to Alembic just so we could have an even polygon character that is good for demonstrations. That's not going to be taking up too much calculation time by itself. If I hit play, you can see we get this nice animation, but it's a little bit staticky as far as polygons are concerned, but that's completely fine. Slicer can totally handle that. Hiding these polygons, NA, we need to create a extensions slicer and take a look at our source geometry. We've already talked about source geometry children, but this time let's use objects mode. When you turn that on, it's going to activate this inexclude, in which we can drag different objects from anywhere in the object manager in. This time, a couple differences you'll see. First of all, the model did not disappear, and that's because if it's not child of it, it's not going to consume it. So by turning off children mode, we can now remote link in, which is great for accessing different parts of the hierarchy and not needing to create duplicates of objects. But there are some specific, I guess I'll say, limitations if you're working this way. The most important one being that because we are remoting into an object, it's important to make sure that your object is in a physical order of operations, meaning you want the slicer to come after the objects it's been fed. This behaves exactly like the tracer object, that you want it to come after the objects it's referencing. Otherwise, in the viewport, you might get a frame of lag on certain things. They still render correctly, but in the viewport, a frame of lag. Just make sure it is moved after the object it's referencing, and you'll be completely fine. Now, we got a couple different icons inside of this. Well, I want to see this a little bit better. So how about changing the axis to bottom, put a couple extra slices in there, and now let's take a look at these. There's the object, here's the object's icon, but then we have this checkbox for activating or deactivating if it's being fed in. To show this better, I'll make a cube. We'll drag that in as well. And you can see that the figure is being sliced and the cube is being sliced. But I can say, hey, don't slice the cube. It's still in there. We can just focus on the figure, or do the opposite and just slice the cube. Doesn't affect the objects outside of it, but they will no longer be calculated. Thank you, cube. Don't need it anymore. Back to slicer. Turning that on, the next button is this display icon. Now, you'll see the low poly object has stoplights, and they're both set to neutral. They're set to gray, meaning, just show up normally. If I click this display button, automatically those stoplights will turn red, meaning don't show in the viewport and don't show in the renderer. And the icon changes. If I click it again, it's going to put it back to neutral. So just a quick way of hiding your objects from both the renderer and the viewport. That way you can focus on just the slices. Two last little details here. The source geometry, when you're twirled down like this, can eat up a lot of screen real estate. And if you don't want to do that, in newer versions of Cinema, you have this bar. You can drag it up and take up very little space that way. But we also created this little twirl down, or in this case, a twirl up. That way we don't have to see any of that, and it takes up minimal space. Moving on to the next feature, it is orientation. To see that a little bit better, I would like to change the axis to center. So it's pivoting from the center. You'll see if I zoom out, that's half below the character, half above. We could, of course, because we're in remote objects mode, we can move this up and place it anywhere we like, and it's not affecting the model, and that's actually pretty powerful. So we can move anywhere we like. I will say from bottom and reset the PSR, or now it's called, what is it called now? Reset transform. So anyway, that's zeroed out. So what do we got? Orientation. Like I said, I want that to be from center, sorry. So orientation, change that to X plus. So instead of going up on Y, we're now slicing on the X axis. You can see a bunch of almost vertical slices here from the front, but go to the side, you see how it's all chopped up in that orientation. We can, of course, change the spread and have those be a little bit tighter and get to see more of the cuts, or we can spread them out more. Changing the orientation to Z plus, we can slice front to back and get cuts that way and get a completely different look on the figure. Of course, hitting play, this will animate. That'll animate the entire character. The cuts are just continuing to go straight through. These cuts actually go out to infinity on these axes. So you have no limitations. You just pick the orientation and it should just work from there. There's actually one last orientation, and that is object Z plus. Creating that, it will make a link field for you, and you can link any object in there that you want. But in this case, I don't have an object to link to, so I can hit create, and that will make a null for us with an appropriate name. Selecting that, I can now take that and move it anywhere I want. So I could scoot it forward and backward. You can see, if I do it slowly, we can see these different cuts passing through the model. We can also hit R for rotate and spin that and get cuts exactly where we place them. So now we are able to, independent of the actual slicer object, move their placement, their center point, and their orientation by rotating it. And that's all by using this null. It's actually pretty powerful, and we'll be talking about that more. And keep in mind that would be really, really useful if you're in children mode, because if you're in children mode, you could not move the slicer without moving the child along with it, or at least not easily. So by remoting into a null to get your orientation and exact position, then that frees you up to not worry about exactly where the slicer object itself is placed. Now let's put this back to default. We can just go to a simple Y plus, and I don't need that null anymore. And I'll even say axis from the bottom. So we're pretty much back to the beginning, just make it a bit taller. In this video, I will be skipping over the matrix mode and the create matrix button, but that will be covered in a future video, so make sure you check that out as well. Moving on to our next setting, it is expand. To see it a little bit better though, let's turn off our preview cuts, which will turn off this nice little widget gizmo that we've got. Turning that off, we can now just see our final spline. What does expand do? Well, it's pretty straightforward. Based on the orientation of the slice that's happening, we can push it further out and expand it outward. You can also go negative on that, which is important to note, so you can shrink those in. Now, very important to note, this is based on the orientation of the normals of the object, and it's based on the direction of the slice. But there's no special intelligence beyond that. So you could very easily push this to the point where you essentially confuse the spline. So if I push this way in, it's going to be really easy to go find weird spots where the lines are overlapping each other. You can see all these little crisscrosses happen. There's a lot of objects in cinema that would not like that. So there are specific circumstances in which to do the expand, and other ones where it might not work as well, but it does unlock a lot of opportunities. So we want to make sure that that was in there. As a quick for instance, just for fun, how about we expand this out, let's say exactly 2. I'll unhide the object, so we'll bring that back in again. You can kind of see we get this nice outline of it traveling around. And if we were to sweep this, because of course it's a spline, feed that into a sweep. Into the sweep, I shall feed a rectangle spline, which will be huge, but T for scale. Whoop, set those to 2 by 2 just to see them. And now you can see that's expanded outside the character, and we could push that in or out. Let me show you that. We can push this in, which is the original, or push it out. But now you can see that the sweep is getting upset about some of these crisscrossing lines. But that leads us directly into the next setting, which is smooth. And smooth is really powerful. It's going to be implemented in a deeper way in an upcoming tool set that's going to be released. It's actually our next plugin to come out. But we implemented it directly into Slicer. So let me show you what this does. Hitting NB, so you can actually see these subdivisions. You can see that anywhere that the line happened to cut the model, it is where the point is here. By grabbing smooth and increasing it, let's say 1, I've done 1 iteration of smoothing. So what it's doing is taking 1 point and checking on its two neighbors and going to the average point between them. And it's going to keep on repeating that iteration. So even by doing one iteration of smooth, it's able to calm down those kind of overlapping edges and make cleaner geometry. So that's very, very powerful. We could add additional iterations to it and smooth it out more. And you just want to make it so that the splines are happy and something like the sweep or the extrude would work with it. We'll get into the specifics of that when it's time, but you can see how those combine really well. And because we're here, there's a twirl down on the smooth for an even more specialized setting, and that is enabling you to transition from all of these different iterations of smoothing from the current state all the way to the original one. So those, of course, will pop back in, but ignoring that, by increasing that, we can go back to the original shape or to the fully smooth shape, turning off the sweep. Let's just pull it out of the sweep. You can see how that will transition from one to the other. And it's just that the sweep doesn't like certain sharp angles like that. And that is where the smoothing is actually getting rid of those sharp angles. But you never know where they will appear. But yeah, that is expand and smooth. Collapsing that back down, resetting, resetting. Let's move on to our next setting, which is rate. Rate is going to, let me turn preview cuts back on again to get our widget back. It is going to take the bottommost line, so that one, and the topmost line, and it's going to transition between the two over the course of 1 second if the rate was at 100%. Let's go a little bit more mild than that and say 5%. And now hit play. Actually, before I hit play, let me just say this character shouldn't animate. So in the Alembic, I'm going to say, hey, don't use the animation. So selecting slicer at 5% rate, hit play. We can now see these lines traveling right through that character. So you can see they start at the bottom, they travel all the way up. As soon as it hits the top, it's going to reset and jump them back down to the bottom and continue that loop forever. So you can change this to whatever speed you want. At a certain speed, you're probably going to, it's going to look like it goes in reverse because it's moving so quickly. So we'll keep it in the relatively slow speeds there. But yeah, that is creating a nice offset. You can go negative. It's a very important design principle we have, which is any value that we can leave unclamped, we unclamp. And if we can make it go negative, we're going to make it go negative. So yeah, there's a little bit of rate. It adds a lot of opportunities and a lot of really cool animation that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. Now, of course, that is working on top of the animated object. Let's make that be animated and select the slicer. Hitting play, you can see now we've got the animated figure, and these lines are still slowly, let me speed it up, you can see they are still traveling along the character. So yeah, that works in conjunction perfectly. Okay, cool. So having done that, let's get rid of the, well, I just won't hit play. The next setting is spacing. Now, we've already been using the spread a bunch because it was super relevant, but we've got additional settings here for spacing, currently set to the total size of whatever the spread is. But we can change that to a different mode, which is per step. So by changing it per step, I can say, hey, that's exactly supposed to be 5 units in between each cut. And you can see we've got 58 cuts, so I could start decreasing that. And you see, as I decrease the number of slices, it's actually going to say, okay, it's 45 times 5, so that is how tall that will eventually be. And of course, we go back to our original one. But way better than that is this convert button. Pretty much I never click on this. It's important for it to be here, but I never click on this because we have convert. If you click convert, it's going to take the current slices and the current spread and switch it to the other mode, so it doesn't visually change at all, but now we have a full spread, so I can change that. And then if I change it to that size and that number of slices, I can say, okay, cool, now convert it, and now we're back to per step. I can be like, okay, it's close to 9. I want it to be exactly 9, and now convert it back again. We're back to total size, and we still have the same number of slices and very precise numbers. So very fun to swap between those. And then we've got auto scale, which is incredibly powerful. I do use it all the time. So let's say that we had this kind of small, and we don't know how big this character is, and you don't want to perfectly eyeball it, and maybe it's a little bit off the ground, which, you know, at certain points in this jump it might be. Yeah, you can be slightly off the ground. I can say, you know what, that's not quite where it's supposed to be, and then click auto scale. Auto scale will automatically make it so the bottom line is exactly where the foot is beginning and exactly where this hand is ending. Important to note, that will automatically put you into object Z+ and create a null, and that null is going to get placed exactly where it needs to be. That is mostly because when you're in children mode, you don't want to move the slicer object because that'll move the children as well, and by putting it into the null, then your object will stay exactly where it's supposed to be. But you can see it's perfectly scaled, matching exactly the bounding box of the object. But where it can get fun and interesting is we can change this however we want. Let's say the axis is from the center. That'll change it by just say, hey, auto scale again. So now it's auto scaled, and now the null is pivoting from the center because we said, hey, this is from the center. And then I can take that null and say, well, let's try rotating it to some weird orientation. And I'm going to intentionally make it too small. So it's like weird orientation and way too small. Under slicer, back to auto scale. Now it's going to take the current orientation and make it perfectly from the foot all the way to the top of where the hand currently is. So auto scale, just a way of perfectly matching your model in its current state, and really easy to, still take that and be like, you know what, I want a little taller after that, but I know it's approximately capturing the entire model. So yep, that is our auto scale and all of the spacing settings, but that is not all of the spread settings. Let's reset this a little bit to make it cleaner. So orientation back to Y+, pivot from the bottom, and we don't need the null anymore. Selecting the slicer. Let's go a little taller as well. Selecting the slicer again, we have more settings. We want to keep this interface nice and clean, not be overwhelming. So under spread, there are some bonus options. Twirling it down, you can see we've got a couple extra settings. Specifically, the first one being variation. Variation will change the spacing of the slices. So dragging that up, we can get complete random variation. Starting at the bottom and going to the top, they might be placed anywhere. We have a seed control here. You type in a different number or click this randomize button to get completely randomized numbers and get different placement. That combines on top of rate. So if we hit play on rate, you'll see that that will still be traveling up. In fact, with the extra variation, we hit play a little bit faster and you can actually see them showing up at different times, traveling along. That doesn't change the speed of the rate at all. It just changes their placement, but that extra variation goes a long way. Now, you might be noticing on certain frames, something's popping up here. And let me show you what that is. Because what's happening? Yeah, there's a frame. So it's saying open edge detected, swap to open spline. What's happening is the remesher put a hole in this model. Somewhere in this model, there's a hole. I don't know where. Oh, there it is. So you see there's a hole in the model right there. And Slicer is detecting that there's a hole in the model. And it's saying, hey, this is a model that might not be watertight. Would you like to change this from a closed spline to an open spline? And since that's only happening once in a while, it's just kind of booping on and off. So if you wanted to, if that was happening in this case, you can just say no, and it won't worry about it. And that'll just disappear until, actually that will disappear until you change certain spline settings, which we will not worry about right now. But yeah, it's really handy where it's really easy to forget that you're in a closed spline in a 2D environment, but that's something we'll get into later. We don't need to worry about it. I just wanted to say what that was in case it pops up and you needed to see it. And then, okay, so that's variation. Getting rid of that, we've got offset, which isn't going to do a lot for us right now in this particular circumstance. But what that will do is take it based on the current orientation, in which case Y plus. I can grab the offset and everything, the final cuts will all just move up on Y plus. You can also go negative, which, isn't doing much for us right now, but later on when we are doing fancy things with the cloners, you'll see that that can become very useful. And lastly, we have spacing, and spacing is great. It's not going to look like much on this figure, but let me show you. If I were to drag it, let's hide the figure. If I drag our spacing down, every single individual slice will go down to the origin point. Doesn't look like too much here. It's kind of a mess, even though it's kind of cool. Let's go back to our other scene file. And in this scene file, we've got the same basic setup going. So let's say axis from the bottom, and here's our spacing. If I collapse that down, you'll see that we get a nice flat landscape. So now it's become two-dimensional, but the slices were calculated based on how tall that landscape used to be. And now we can see that we get this final effect. And a little sneak preview of things we'll be doing later. If we add a little bit of rate on top of this, let me put the spacing back. Here's what's happening when the rate is turned on. These are slowly traveling up. But if we go and flatten those down, it's completely flat. And now we just have a series of lines traveling towards the center. So those combine really, really nicely. We could add some variation on top of that. And you see that these will spread out in different spots. Just get a little bit more flavor with the way those are placed. It does open up a lot of cool opportunities. When it comes to Slicer overall, we wanted to create a very open-ended tool so that you can make it do what you want it to do. But that means there are combinations of settings that won't look good on something. For instance, spacing looks really good on something like this landscape, but spacing didn't look like much when we go to this figure. When you collapse those down, it's just kind of this weird blob. If I play, it's going to be moving around. It might kind of look like a silhouette of a figure from the top, but I don't know how useful that would specifically be. But as I said, we want to keep everything as open as possible. bringing our figure back up. Oh, important to note that spacing can go, we can overshoot, we can go above 100% and make it extra tall, and you can even go negative, and technically that entire thing could become inverted underneath. So a little bit weird, but it gives you the options whenever we can. So let's collapse that again. We don't need to see those settings. We've already been talking about the axis a bunch. That's just where we pivot from. And then we've got preview cuts, which we've already been turning on and off to hide our widget. Then there is draw original points. So if you kind of lost yourself and you don't know where your model is, or maybe if there's more pieces you're missing somewhere, you can say draw original points, and that will just create a little dot on every point just to give you a quick representation of where that model is. Turning that off. Lastly, we have the help button, which will bring you to the help page. This video will be embedded on that, as well as frequently asked questions and just anything you might need to make sure that you're using this tool to its fullest extent. And then we have this examples button where there's nothing there right now, but as time goes on, there's going to be more and more examples of these different spline tools and how you might be able to reverse engineer and create different cool things. So that's what that is designed for. That's going to wrap up this video. Make sure you check out the rest of the videos in the series. As I mentioned, there's a quick start, which is more project-based instead of going step by step through every single setting. But it's very important to know how this works because, like I said, we tried to make a powerful tool that unlocks whatever you might need to do along these lines. So thank you so much for watching and for purchasing Rocket Slicer, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.